In 2008, my closest friend, Jane, a longtime teacher and librarian, went outdoors during a terrible windstorm and was struck to the ground by a falling tree limb. The weight of the limb snapped her spinal cord, and a protruding branch pierced her skull. She suffered a simultaneous spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury. Recovery from neural injuries is long and slow. Although she may never recover the function she had before the accident, my friend continues to progress 5 years later. It was in witnessing her treatment, adaptation, and recovery that I began to learn about what it means to be a woman with a spinal cord injury. The medical aspects of the injury, the rehabilitation and therapy, the dramatic changes in relationships and identity were significant. What I noticed most markedly, though, was the struggle against attitudes and misunderstandings as Jane disagreed with the limitations and expectations she encountered as a woman in a wheelchair. The special circumstances surrounding women with SCI, an injury that affects predominantly men, make their experiences a prime starting point for examining the situation of women with disabilities, their perspectives, their status in the mainstream culture, issues of identity and access, and not least their attitudes toward, experience of, and right to pleasure. Neural injury begins with an initial insult, triggering a cascade of damage from the site of insult through the nervous system as a whole. The secondary aspects of the injury, as the cell damage progresses through the system like cracks through a frozen lake, are more devastating than the first traumatic blow, as nerve cells are marked for inevitable death in a process that is difficult to arrest. The wound is merely the tip of the iceberg, signaling a far greater injury beneath. Mimicking the path of physical injury is the injury to the social being, which is ruptured in its connectedness as the spinal cord is ruptured from its neural connections. The body has long, perhaps always, complicated the study of women. Women's status in their cultures is imagined, determined, and dictated by difficult-to-govern formulae of performance, perception, biology, mythology, and anatomy. The category of disability further complicates this continuum of identity. We see ample evidence of this complication in U.S. visual culture. Women visibly living with any disability are rarely shown in advertising, television, magazines, or film. I will examine the 2012 reality television series Push Girls as a departure from this lack of representation of women in wheelchairs, probing it through lenses of feminist psychoanalytic theory and disability theory to better understand whether and in what ways it may act as a new representation of women living with disabilities. Finally, I will engage Julie Allen and her use of Foucault to frame an ethics of inclusion in order to better understand the responsibilities of and actions available to all individuals in furthering recognition and full participation for people living with disabilities. As women are such a small minority of people living with SCI, the majority of the medical research and medical discourse related to this condition focuses on men. This reality, combined with the lack of visible representatives of this community in the mainstream culture, results in social invisibility for these women. A fact sheet available online informs readers that, quote, the effect of SCI on female sexuality is far less devastating than on males, end quote, and also that the physiological sexual responses for women are mostly internal and less conspicuous than in males, and therefore more difficult to study. The same document discounts female patients' accounts about changes in their own sexuality after injury. Quote, most of the information that has been reported is subjective, i.e., obtained by history from patients rather than from scientific observation, and is thus likely to be less accurate, end quote. This last statement effectively closes off the entire topic of women's sexuality and SCI, as the physical responses are too difficult to study and subjective accounts are not scientific. Axel Honneth, a philosopher working in critical theory, writes particularly about issues of power and respect in society. After Habermas, he asserts that invisibility is the lack of social recognition, and that recognition is necessary for self-realization. Recognition possesses a performative character, this is a quote, because the expressive responses that accompany it symbolize the practical ways of reacting that are necessary in order to do justice to the person recognized. Honneth clarifies what he means when he maintains that human beings require recognition. He distinguishes between the German Erkennen, which refers to cognition, the apprehending of a person's presence in a way that is receptive and describes the perceiver's incorporation of the person into a cognitive framework in the perceiver's own mind. This, in contrast with the vital and subsequent Anerkennen, which is productive, referring to the perceiver's active social acknowledgement of a person, which serves as affirmation and public recognition. The experience of living as a woman with spinal cord injury is not given sufficient attention in either the medical or mainstream communities, a reality which equates to lack of recognition. As Honneth asserts, recognition is necessary for self-realization, and the effect of this lack is that women with SCI fall into an uncertain territory of identity. In order to understand the barriers to recognition for women with spinal cord injuries, it's beneficial to look at phenomenology and psychoanalytic literary theory. Merleau-Ponty theorizes that structures of perception, as they relate to the body, are shaped by the nature of the body as both body subject and body object. Quote, "It is by means of such body schemas that we are able to act intentionally in the world, and though they most commonly operate at a pre-reflective level, they constitute our sense of ourselves as corporeal beings. In this way, our human bodies only exist as we perceive them. In understanding the experience of spinal cord injury, it's helpful to incorporate Lakoff and Johnson in their claim that conceptual structure arises from our sensory motor experience and the neural structures that give rise to it. The very notion of structure in our conceptual system is characterized by such things as image schemas and motor schemas. Linda Alcoff has explored invisible identities, the ways in which individuals are determined and understood through perceived characteristics of their physical bodies. She writes, "Both race and sex are most definitely physical, marked on and through the body, lived as a material experience, visible as surface phenomena and determinant of economic and political status. In this way, understanding of one's identity is based on the ways in which gender and ability are reflected in physical characteristics which are automatically attributed to a culturally articulated category. The more unstable the category, the more unstable the available social and subject identity." As we examine the language we find in the context of neural injury, physical rehabilitation, and paralysis, we find illuminated its experiential analog. After the initial trauma of a spinal cord injury, there occurs a secondary cascade of effects that worsens the damage exponentially. The online medical reference Medscape describes this. More commonly, the injury level rises 1 or 2 spinal levels during the hours to days after the initial event. A complex cascade of pathophysiologic events related to free radicals, vasogenic edema, and altered blood flow accounts for this clinical deterioration. Subjective Bodies, an essay in Foucault and the Government of Disability, suggests a social parallel to this destructive cascade. In this work, Sullivan describes the processes and protocols that are typically used to treat and rehabilitate spinal cord injuries as critical to the production of a paraplegic. He describes the way that medical power is directed toward producing a governable, productive body. He writes, "Recently admitted patients to a rehab hospital spinal unit learn very quickly that they have not only lost the power to move and feel their bodies, they have in addition lost possession of their bodies in terms of knowledge and control. Attitudes in the medical establishment toward pain, recovery of function, and even the appropriateness of specific types of catheters for urination combine to communicate that a person's sensations, preferences, and identity are under the control of the experts." A woman with SCI is invisible in the medical system in the sense that she is at once a paralyzed subject, surrendered to the treatment protocols for her injury, and also a null entity as a female with a condition that is gendered male. Referring back to the cultural articulation of identity, Judith Butler writes, "My view in Bodies That Matter was that there is an insistent materiality of the body, but that it never makes itself known or legible outside of the cultural articulation in which it appears. This suggests that we cannot experience the body, cannot communicate the body without doing so culturally. In this way, we can sense how a woman with SCI's own experience is culturally constrained, and that her attitudes, her ambitions, and her pleasure become lost, illegible. In an interview in 2001, Butler discusses the difficulties inherent in gendered identity in the context of transgender individuals. Becoming a gender is a laborious process of becoming naturalized, which requires a differentiation of bodily pleasures and parts on the basis of gendered meanings. Very often, what is wanted in terms of pleasure requires an imaginary participation in body parts, either appendages or orifices that one might not actually possess. Or similarly, pleasure may require imagining an exaggerated or diminished set of parts. Butler's attention to body parts in this passage can relate to identity and gender in disability as well. As she suggests, a person can achieve gender recognition only by occupying a culturally recognizable category. In order for some gender identities to occupy such categories, a measure of imaginary transformation is required to make the body parts match the requirements of the category. Not only does a woman with SCI have to demonstrate in the mainstream culture that she can occupy the category of woman with all its ambiguity, but she must also demonstrate that she can occupy the category of person, as she inhabits a body living with paralysis. A woman like Jane must defend her performance of both personness and womanness before she can even reach the possibility of a sexual identity, and for many, it is easier just to give up. With a couple of noted exceptions, medical experts have paid little attention to female sexual response, sexual self-esteem, and relationships in SCI. Recent survey and laboratory studies of these women and women with other disabilities have begun to generate data on sexual self-esteem, sexual interest, activity, and behavior. One study in particular at Rutgers was based on women with complete SCI relaying their lived experience of sex and pleasure. The study elucidated that the ability to communicate sexual needs and desires came with an increasing sense of self and value as a human being. Although the women had regained their sense of identity as people in the world, their sense of sexual identity lagged years, even 15 years post-injury, behind this other sense of self. Paralyzed women must navigate the same series of identity checkpoints that can paralyze any woman. Performing the roles of person and woman, the acceptability of experiencing sexual pleasure, motherhood, while trying to discern which are the expressions of sexuality, pleasure, or agency that might render her invalid and invisible, nullifying previous checkpoints and bringing her back to ground zero, the site of injury. The 2012 reality show Push Girls was originally billed as the opportunity to meet 4 friends who don't let their wheelchairs define them. The show depicts 4 women with spinal cord injuries who live in California: Audie, Tiffany, Angela, and Mia. The women are beautiful and stylish in the mainstream runway model Hollywood sense, and they have varied careers and relationship statuses. Although some aspects of the show's content are stark in their ability to illustrate some of the real challenges of living with paralysis, such as relying on a romantic partner to help with toileting, some of the others seem less real and more typical of some earlier reality show examples, such as the Real Housewives series. The glamour of the group is somewhat suspect, recalling Mattel's 1990s introduction of Becky, a wheelchair-using Barbie doll who was not able to fit into the Dreamhouse elevator. Rosemarie Garland Thompson, who theorizes disability, suggests that, quote, women are the proper object of the male gaze, while disabled people are the proper object of the stare. The Push Girls representation is complex, and the questions it raises beg the issue of whether viewers are invited to gaze, stare, do both, or engage in some entirely separate response. If women live their bodies as objects for an external gaze, how then do they live bodies that deviate from an ableist norm? In this clip from season 1, episode 1, Everyone Stares, Mia and Tiffany go to the gym to work out. Mia explains the image consciousness of Los Angeles and points out how this conflicts with stereotypes of appearance in people with disabilities. If I can get out of here.
I think in LA there is pressure to look your best. People are very image oriented out here.
Let's go hook that rope up and do some of these little pull down things.
Why isn't it coming down? It usually comes down when I do that. To lasso it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay. Now we're not letting this go.
Being in a wheelchair does create an image in other people's minds. So I think it's nice if they see somebody that looks like they've taken an effort in their appearance. I think most people haven't seen sexy in a wheelchair, and that's why they can't fathom it. Being yourself is really sexy, and confidence. That is a huge turn on.
Mia and Tiffany clearly represent their fitness motivation in terms of appearance in this segment. This is another example of women producing their bodies to meet an accepted norm, right? Except that those bodies cannot meet that norm. She cannot hide that chair. She cannot hide that she is seated half the height of the people who walk by, no matter how many reps she does. Still, the workout scene does not have an air of desperation or lack, but instead suggests pride. When the pull-down machine is stuck with the pulley clip at the top, inaccessible, the women do not register shame or helplessness, but instead Mia gives Tiffany a boost so that she can reach up to grasp it. When she succeeds, they enjoy a second of celebration and then get on with the workout. Examples from common ableist language like handicap, confinement, disabled, crippled, dependent, paralyzed are simply not the first words that come to mind when viewing this scene. The wheelchairs in the show are designed to be seen, sporting decorative rims and seats. They lend intention to the reality of using a chair. The message is, I do not live paraplegia or quadriplegia in the way that is conventionally produced. I live the body as I see fit. I am not a woman in a wheelchair. I am the woman who rides these custom rims. There's a confident rebellion at work in this series. We see Mia and Tiffany and their friends incite a collision between the stare and the gaze, rendering both inadequate. The Push Girls are creating a distinct identity category for women with spinal cord injuries. The Push Girl category may even be stable enough on which to anchor a right to pleasure. They are working at ground zero. Thank you.